There are questions about how many Commonwealth countries might drop the British monarch as their head of state now that Queen Elizabeth has died and Charles is in charge. Barbados declared itself independent and removed the monarch as its head of state just last year, almost 400 years after the first British ship reached its shores and invested in plantation slavery on the island. Then Prince Charles was there representing the crown during the celebration alongside Rihanna, who was declared a national hero of the Caribbean Republic during those festivities. Already, we're seeing headlines asking if Canada, for example, should sever ties with the British crown. The same calls are now happening in Australia. And in June, Jamaica began the process of becoming an independent republic. The country is expected to make it official, removing Charles as its head of state before its next general election in 2025. King Charles wants to continue his mother's legacy within the Commonwealth, but how much that Commonwealth will itself change when more and more countries are aiming to break away from their colonial past? That's something we're going to talk about now with Lola Adesoye, social and political writer and commentator born and raised in London. Lola, thank you for leaving London and coming to talk with me this evening.
Thanks for having me.
So how meaningful is it for Brits when these Commonwealth countries break away, when they say, no longer are we going to have your monarch as our head of state? Does that have an effect?
I don't know if it has an effect on Brits within Great Britain, but clearly it does have an effect on people who are outside, you know. And also, I think symbolically it has an effect on, say, people like me, whose parents come from other places and, you know, born and raised in the UK or have lived in the UK for a long time, in terms of that reclamation, I think, of the past and moving into the future.
Do you feel like that is a powerful movement these days in England, that this sort of notion that Britain needs to make amends with its colonial past? I will draw everyone's attention to an op-ed in the New York Times, which addresses that very question. In recent years, public pressure has been building on the British state and institutions to acknowledge and make amends for the legacies of empire, slavery, and colonial violence. In 2013, in response to a lawsuit brought by victims of torture in colonial Kenya, the British government agreed to pay nearly £20 million in damages to survivors. Another payout was made in 2019 to survivors in Cyprus. Efforts are underway to reform school curriculums, to remove public monuments that glorify empire, and to alter the presentation of historic sites linked to imperialism. I mean, in the U.S., our analog is slavery, right?
Yeah.
The Confederate monuments.
Yeah.
And that has created, in turn, a very fraught debate and turned into a political firefight, not figuratively, not literally. And I wonder if you think Charles is the person to manage this in the way that he must as the head of the state.
I mean, the conversation about, you know, addressing wrongs from the past and the colonial legacy and the legacy of slavery in the UK has been gaining traction for some time. And yes, there have been monuments that are pulled down. They're decolonising the curriculum in some places and so on and so forth. I do think, though, there's sort of a bit of a general resistance to the history, like to the truth, that I think is slightly different here. I think here, even when people don't like the topic, they can still, you know, yeah, they're enslaved people.
They can acknowledge that it happened.
Exactly. But I think that the general story of the history of the empire has been very, very whitewashed. And there are a lot of people who still think the empire was just this great thing, I guess, about tea. So in terms of Charles leading forward, I think he's going to be met with people, you know, in civil society that are going to be saying, hey, we need to get this conversation going. You need to do something. You need to say something about this. And if not, we're just going to continue anyway.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, and a historian we spoke with last evening mentioned this, the Commonwealth has come home to England. It is, I think, 1 in 7 people is from parents outside of England who may have been part of the colonies or part of the colonial realm. And that is fundamentally changing the nature of the conversation, isn't it, as well?
Well, the chickens always come home to roost. And ultimately, you know, if you go to places and they end up being destabilised, people move, you know, economic migration and stuff, and for education. And so everyone's ended up back in the, you know, the homeland, essentially.
Well, and you are British. You are the face of England as much as King Charles is.
And I'm also one that's left. Well, so that's also a story.
Well, that is a story, right? The expats and expats of color who are no longer in the UK. You know, there are questions, and I say this as the daughter of someone who was raised in a former British colony. There are those places, India, for example, where the death of the Queen, the news has been greeted with a sort of mix of sadness and, I would say, questioning, if not outright indignation. I don't think a lot of people know this, but hours before Queen Elizabeth died, Narendra Modi, the PM in India, renamed Kingsway, which was named after King George V, Elizabeth's grandfather. They renamed it Kartavya Path, which is like the most literal example of the way India is reclaiming its history from the Brits. Prime Minister Modi, while inaugurating the Kartavya Path, said Rajpath, the Kingsway, was for the British, for whom the people of India were slaves. It was a symbol of colonialism. Now its architecture has changed and its spirit has also changed. Now, that is an awkward juxtaposition, right?
Yeah.
And then hours later is the passing of the Queen, and India is expected to sort of offer some condolences of some kind. And yet, you know, they're not wrong. How do you think Brits look upon that kind of pushback?
Well, I do think some are resistant to it, but there are two things. There's one, the institution of the Queen. I mean, probably the most famous woman in the world, one of the most powerful brands in the world. You know, she has power as a head of state, but she also had a lot of soft power. And there was a reason why I think some of the Commonwealth countries have sort of stayed within the Commonwealth because of that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's the institution of the monarchy, which has always been problematic to people who care to sort of be critical about it. And if you know anything about colonialism or you've experienced it, of course you would be critical of it. The British Empire was not a good thing for anybody else who wasn't British. So, you know, this
white male British especially.
Exactly. This tiny place on the map. I mean, you look at the UK on the map, you can just about see it. How did it become a place that was responsible for, what, hundreds of millions of people around the world without violence, without oppression, without tyranny? I mean, seriously, it just doesn't even make sense. So there's a whole story about that that people want to tell now, and maybe felt they couldn't say before.
Under Elizabeth, who is in many ways stitching it all together. It is going to be a very interesting chapter in Britain or the UK and British identity. Lola Adesoye, social and political writer and commentator, thank you for your time tonight and offering some insight on our friends across the pond.